Okay, let's dive back in. Today, we're wrapping up really a remarkable story, our deep look into Eritrea's decades-long journey to independence.
That's right.
If you've been with us, for the first two parts, you've seen how colonial promises sort of faded, led into annexation under Ethiopia, rights were stripped.
And how that suppression really ignited the spark of resistance.
Yeah.
We traced it from the Italian colony, British administration, the federation that was meant to mean autonomy.
Only to see it dismantled.
Completely.
Yeah.
And Eritrea absorbed by Ethiopia,
Hmm.
pushing this distinct identity towards basically fighting for survival.
And now, for this final part, we're tracing that armed struggle itself, following it from its beginnings, early 1960s, through incredible hardship, shifting global powers.
Yeah, the Cold War context is huge here.
Absolutely. And ultimately to those decisive military victories in the early 1990s that finally secured independence.
The notes and sources we have really lay this out with striking detail. It's the account of a 3-decade war fought against, well, formidable odds.
Often with the world just looking the other way.
Pretty much. It wasn't quick. It was a long, protracted national liberation struggle defined by just extraordinary resilience, sheer determination.
So let's unpack this incredible journey. From that initial spark to, well, the wildfire that transformed a nation, our source material tells us it began very specifically. September 1st, 1961, Gash, Barca region.
Right.
And it wasn't some massive uprising to start with. The source notes it started with Hamid Idrisawate, a seasoned soldier, and just a small group.
Yeah, literally just a handful of old rifles, as the source puts it, starkly. But from those very humble beginnings, those hit-and-run skirmishes, the movement started growing.
So what started small, maybe easily dismissed by the authorities as just bandits?
Exactly. That's how they framed it. But it rapidly transformed into a full-scale liberation war. It didn't just stay contained. It quickly spread, engulfed the population, becoming a truly national movement, fueled by that desire for self-determination we talked about.
What's really fascinating here, and I think a key insight from the source, is the stark contrast.
Right.
Who was involved globally? Eritrea's resistance, largely unsupported internationally, especially early on.
Very little support.
Meanwhile, they're facing Ethiopian regimes, successive ones, with extensive, powerful foreign backing.
Absolutely. For much of the struggle, Ethiopia got significant military, diplomatic, financial support from major Cold War players. Initially, the U.S. providing substantial aid to Emperor Haile Selassie's regime.
And the source highlights, alongside the Americans, Israel even had a military pact with Ethiopia, sending advisors, training teams.
That's right, a pact. So you have this relatively small, homegrown resistance, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF, that's mainly who we'll be talking about.
Right.
Facing an Ethiopian military, fortified by aid, expertise from powers like the U.S. and Israel. Yet, and the source points this out, even this bolstered military, considered one of Africa's best at the time, failed to contain the growing Eritrean resistance.
Which points to something critical, doesn't it? The depth of popular support.
Exactly. The EPLF wasn't just some isolated military force. It was deeply embedded in the population. That made it incredibly difficult for any amount of external support alone to really suppress it. They were fighting an army, yes, but also effectively a unified people.
Then the political landscape in Ethiopia shifts dramatically. Mid-70s, right? Internal pressures were mounting.
They were. By 73, you had widespread famine, rebellion in the Ogaden region, and critically, that increasing pressure from Eritrean forces up north. This internal turmoil, it culminated in 1974, the overthrow of the monarchy by the Provisional Military Administrative Council, the Derg, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam.
And this is where those Cold War dynamics get even more complex. Kind of bizarre, frankly, because Mengistu later realigns the country, once a key U.S. ally.
The switches sides, completely, aligns with the Soviet Union.
Right.
But what's particularly noteworthy, and the source really emphasizes this, is that despite this ideological shift, this new alignment, U.S. and Israeli support for Ethiopia actually continued for a time, even after the Derg took power. It really illustrates the tangled, pragmatic, geopolitical threads being pulled in the Horn of Africa during the Cold War. It wasn't always about neat ideology.
Okay, so by late 1977, the EPLF forces had actually made massive gains. They'd liberated most of the countryside, laying siege to major cities like Massawa on the coast and Asmara, the capital.
That was a critical moment. It showed just how effective the EPLF had become. Moving beyond small skirmishes to challenging control over large areas, cities.
Always a but.
There is. This high point for the EPLF coincided with Ethiopia facing another major external threat, war with Somalia over the Ogaden region. The Soviet
Ah.
Union responded decisively, supporting their new ally, Ethiopia, pouring in vast amounts of modern arms, thousands of military advisors.
And not just advisors, but actual troops, too.
Yes, the source highlights thousands of Cuban and South Yemeni troops deployed alongside the Soviet support. This huge external intervention was absolutely crucial for Ethiopia. Well, it didn't just help them repel Somalia and the Ogaden. Critically, as the source clearly states, it allowed them to consolidate and then shift their military focus. Their vast resources, now heavily reinforced back onto Eritrea.
So the tide turns again? Dramatically. And the EPLF is forced into a strategic retreat.
They were. They regrouped in the rugged, mountainous Sahel region, northern part of the country, and here they established Nakfa, not just as a military base, but as a powerful symbol of resistance, of defensive capability.
Nakfa. It becomes almost legendary in this story, doesn't it? Your source talks about years of stalemate there, the sheer inability of the Ethiopian forces to dislodge them.
Indeed. Between 78 and 81, Ethiopia launched 5 major offensives aimed specifically at capturing Nakfa.
5.
5. All failed. Then in 1982, Mengistu launches Operation Red Star, deploys a truly massive force, over 136,000 troops, still benefiting from Soviet backing.
136,000 troops against the EPLF dug in at Nakfa. That sounds overwhelming.
It was designed to be. But Operation Red Star also failed, catastrophically for Ethiopia. Immense cost tens of thousands of lives. It severely damaged the morale, the operational capability of their army.
So the key insight there.
The inability, despite all that force, all that external backing, to dislodge the EPLF from Nakfa fundamentally changed the dynamic of the war. It proved the EPLF couldn't just be crushed defensively. It became this powerful symbol of Eritrean defiance and capability.
Right. So after these failed offensives, the source notes the EPLF steadily regains the initiative, transitioning from purely defensive strategies to offensive operations, and then comes a major turning point on the battlefield.
Yes, a battle often described as the pivotal military moment, the Battle of Alphabet in March 1988.
Alphabet.
Alphabet was Ethiopia's heavily fortified regional headquarters in the north. This wasn't a small guerrilla action. Your source likens it to major historical battles like El Alamein or Dien Bien Phu, calling it specifically Africa's largest battle since World War II.
That's a massive comparison. What happened there?
A crushing Ethiopian defeat. The EPLF executed this complex, coordinated assault that just overwhelmed the Ethiopian forces. The victory at Alphabet wasn't just a huge morale boost for the EPLF.
No, it sounds like more than that.
It was. It was a profound demonstration of their their tactical superiority, proving they could not only defend effectively, but actually defeat a large, well-equipped conventional army in a major engagement. It was a game changer, truly.
That definitely sounds like the tide turning for good, shifting the balance of power decisively on the ground. What came next after such a monumental victory?
Following Alphabet, the EPLF continued to press their advantage, launching offensives on different fronts. A key strategic objective became the focus, the crucial port city of Massawa.
Wow, Massawa.
In February 1990, they launched Operation Fenkill.
Operation Fenkill. The source describes it as meticulously planned land and sea assault. Why was Massawa so crucial?
Massawa wasn't just a city. It was Ethiopia's main military supply line into Eritrea. Simple as that. By liberating it, the EPLF would effectively cut off the vital flow of arms, logistics, reinforcements to the Ethiopian army, holding other key spots, like Asmara.
Okay.
Operation Fenkill was incredibly successful, brutal too, led to massive Ethiopian losses. The source estimates nearly 10,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, plus huge quantities of equipment lost.
Severing that critical supply line through Massawa, that must have been strategically devastating for the Ethiopian forces, more than just a blow.
It was. The source states securing Massawa was more than a military victory. It signaled unmistakably that Eritrean independence wasn't just some distant hope anymore. It was an imminent reality.
Right.
With Massawa secured, access cut off, the remaining major strongholds under Ethiopian control were Asmara, the capital up in the highlands, and Assab, the southern port.
And the final push came relatively quickly after that, building on the momentum.
Yes. May 1991, the EPLF launched their final offensive, defeated Ethiopian forces at Dickham, clearing the path towards the capital.
Towards Asmara.
Then swept through surrounding towns, liberated Asmara on May 24, 1991. Assab fell the very next day, effectively ending Ethiopian military control over Eritrea.
Wow. After 30 years of war, fighting against such powerful forces, overcoming immense odds, entering the capital must have been just an incredible moment. For the fighters, for the people.
The source captures that feeling, describes the scene in Asmara as rapturous welcome and scenes of sheer jubilation. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers who had for so long been seen as this formidable force
Yeah.
surrendered. Mengistu himself had fled into exile just a few days earlier, signaling the collapse of the regime.
So after one of the longest liberation wars in modern African history, marked by immense sacrifice, devastation, Eritrea had, really against all predictions, defeated what your source calls Africa's largest, best-equipped army, and finally won its freedom, decisively, on the battlefield.
That military victory in 91 was the culmination. Decisive, but, formal international recognition still needed to happen to solidify their sovereignty on the world stage.
Right, the political piece.
And the source details the steps taken almost immediately after liberation to ensure this.
Okay, so preparations began very quickly for an internationally supervised referendum. This was seen as the crucial, final political, diplomatic step, asserting their undeniable right to self-determination, gaining international legitimacy.
The leadership, notably Isaiah Afwerki, who was then Secretary General of the EPLF, called on the UN to shoulder its, quote, moral responsibilities, stating the time had come to help conduct a free and fair referendum without delay, making the people's will clear.
And that referendum happened 2 years later, in 1993.
It did, meticulously monitored. A broad range of international bodies, the UN, the OAU, Organization of African Unity, the Arab League, representatives from over a dozen countries, over 1 million Eritreans registered and voted inside the country and across the world in the diaspora.
And the result, a clear, unambiguous statement.
Overwhelmingly so. A staggering 98.5% voter turnout. Think about that engagement.
Incredible.
And of those votes counted, an astonishing 99.81% voted for independence. It was definitive, internationally validated, a statement of their collective will.
Which then led to the formal recognition by the global community.
Exactly. In 1993, following that clear, decisive mandate from the referendum, Eritrea was formally welcomed into the international community. Became the 52nd nation-state in Africa, marking the formal endpoint of decades of struggle.
Okay, let's try and bring this whole deep dive together then. We've covered Eritrea's long, complex journey. Colonial rule, the erosion of autonomy, suppression, the spark of resistance, and finally, this long, arduous, ultimately successful military and political struggle for freedom detailed in this final part.
Yeah, from those first shots fired by a small band in '61, through the grueling, symbolic defense of Nakfa, the strategic turning points at Alphabet and Operation Fenkell at Massawa,
The final military push into Asmara and Assab in 91.
and the formal international recognition via that overwhelming 1993 referendum. It's a remarkable, tenacious arc of history. Really is.
The core takeaway from all the source material we've looked at seems powerful. Eritrea's path to independence was anything but easy. It stands as one of the most determined, resilient, and maybe improbable liberation movements of the 20th century.
Fought and won against overwhelming odds.
Yeah.
Often global indifference.
It wasn't just a military victory, it was the hard-won triumph of a collective dream, wasn't it? One that had been dismissed for decades. The end of occupation was the fulfillment of that deep-seated national aspiration forged in resistance.
Absolutely.
And our source emphasizes how this immense struggle the sacrifices made continue to shape the nation's identity today. It's not just history in a book, it's a constant lived reminder, isn't it, of the cost of freedom, the power of a united people pursuing sovereignty against the current.
That shared experience is just deeply embedded in the national consciousness, arguably defining Eritrean identity and its approach to the world.
Absolutely. And thinking about that, a nation forged through such a long, arduous struggle like Eritrea's against powerful regional and global forces. When a nation is built on that kind of foundation, collective sacrifice, resilience, what does that experience fundamentally embed in its spirit and its place in the world? How does the memory of overcoming those immense odds continue to resonate, to influence its path forward?
It's a powerful question, isn't it? About the enduring legacy of collective struggle, how it shapes national character, and how that history continues to inform its actions, its identity on the global stage today. Something to really think about.